I guess. I think so. I don't know. Um, it will just have to come back to me here. Oh, don't crash. All right, the first thing I want to do here for removing this background is this image is at 50%. At 100%, it is like that. It is not particularly sharp. Sharpening an image is one of the most notorious, important, and yet difficult things to do in Photoshop, because if the pixels aren't sharp to begin with, you're really only faking it. However, the tools that people use vary. Sharpen really just makes the pixels more contrasty. I don't think it looks any sharper. Sharpen, edges sharpen more, but there's this one here called Unsharp Mask. A strange name for something that is supposedly making something sharper, calling it Unsharp Mask. What it is trying to do in Unsharp Mask is to find the unsharp pixels and sharpen them. The amount and the radius and the threshold all work together to create a sharpened effect. Most of my friends who use this use a very low pixel radius, like 1 to 2 pixels total, just a couple of pixels, and a high amount. And as I crank this up, it definitely looks sharper, but it also looks very noisy or lossy. These blobby pixel areas, that's called lossiness, where it gets all chunky funky like that. It's not a pretty thing. And it's at 500%. If I increase the radius, that will only get worse. See how nasty that looks? It's horrible. So I'll bring that down to a tiny, like 1 or 2 pixels. Like 1 pixel, 1.1 pixel. And then here, 1.5. And if I use the arrow key up here, there it's at 2 pixels. And now I'll reduce the amount of sharpness here until it looks not horrible. So if I click off and on preview, this is before and this is after. It is slightly better, slightly better. The threshold has to do with how much color it actually chooses, and strangely, as you increase this value, it actually makes it not as sharp, makes it less sharp. So I'm going to keep the threshold down at 0 and increase the radius a little bit. Okay, 2.5 pixels, half of a pixel, doesn't seem like it should exist. And I'll bring this up to, let's say, 150, maybe something like that will be good. It really depends on the use of the image, whether or not this is going to help you out or not. But when I click OK now and zoom out a bit, and I do Command Z and then Command Z again, it definitely looks better with the sharpen. Before, after, okay? So that's Unsharp Mask. Now, the next thing I'm going to do to try to separate this tricky element from the background is use a technique I tried to show you last week but didn't work so well. I think there's a lot less blue in these medallions than in the background. However, I'm going to do a levels adjust because I know the balance is a little flat. The tonality isn't as pronounced as I would like it to be. So I'm going to use Image Adjustments Levels. And here you can see that there's lack in the highlight area, and so I'm increasing the highlights. Ooh, ah, just that makes it look a lot better. It's a lot sharper. And then I'm going to tighten up the shadow areas. So I have more contrast overall. And then the balance is, I think that looks good. And then again, I'll do Command Z and Command Z again. So there's my before and after. If I go to the History panel, I know I haven't talked a lot about the History panel, but Unsharp Mask, open. So previous, next, and current. And now I'm going to use this choice for select color range. Starting with the eyedrop with no plus or minus, just the basic eyedropper, I'm going to click some of this blue area in the background. That looks pretty good. Then I'm going to switch to the Add Eyedropper tool and click around a couple more of these pixels in the background. Oh my gosh, this is working really well, okay? Because the color in the background or on the background is much more distinct than the key color compared to the choice I had last week with the snake. Now all of a sudden I clicked this dark shade of blue and some of the areas in this heart medallion opened up. But it doesn't look like any of the edge area is problematic. So I'm going to leave it like this and just show you here with this fuzziness slider. Fuzziness has to do with the threshold between pixel color. So I'm lowering that to about 28. The default is 40. It's just what it is. And I'm going to click OK. And now you see these marching ants, which represent what is selected. Move my screen over here and close the layers panel. I also showed you last week this thing called Quick Mask, and I currently had that Quick Mask color on blue, but really it's not a very clean job. It is okay, it's not great. This would not be, in my opinion, a very acceptable selection. It did an okay job around this lanyard. I could use this, but I probably would still end up having to do some more tightening up. The way I could perfect this a little bit is by using a paintbrush. I am in this thing called Quick Mask, which again is representing selection as mask. Mask in this case is blue. The mask can be any color you want it to be. It's just up to you. You can double click this and change the mask color to something completely else. And then when you turn this back on again, now the mask is magenta. If I use the zoom tool and zoom in on some of these key areas, I can see here I'm going to switch to my lasso tool and give it a feather of 1 so that the edge is not super sharp. It's ever so slightly smooth or a little bit soft. And what I'm selecting here is the negative area around the bottom of this keyform with my lasso. And I'll stop with this part. Now I'm going to come around to where I began and double click. When I fill this area in with black, which is the color on my foreground chip, it actually is filling it with this magenta color or the mask color, and that's a clean edge. That looks much better. If you notice here in some of these other areas around the outside, this is a hole in the mask. This is not a solid mask, so it's not a clean, solid selection. And the way to deal with that would just be simply to paint that in, which would be extremely time-consuming and fairly boring, unless you really need something to do that's really slow and meditative here. So here I'm filling that in. Okay. Back it off, zoom up, and at some point here, I'd have to travel all around this shape to make that better. Now, where this might be handy is in the negative shapes of this particular odd piece of jewelry that has a lot of divots and negative spots in it. So I'm going to use the polygon lasso again, and I use this like I'm sewing. I'm kind of stitching small little amounts, and I am doing it fairly quickly because I've done this about 30,000 times probably. But what I'm attempting to do is find the edges and use small segment clicks to surround this negative shape here between these two pieces. And again, Option Delete to fill that. So you can see if I do Command D, that is so much a nicer edge than this garbage over here. So let's just say I turn Quick Mask off, and there I'm now in regular selection mode. The piece itself, if I look at the layers panel, which I just closed a moment ago, is not locked. The background is not locked. And what is selected is the background. So if I hit delete now and deselect, you can see all of the remnants of the bits that were not selected. And you can also see the very unclean edge. So it's kind of okay in this case for a hack and slash, which is not your best selection, but it can save you some time, and then you may still have to come around through. And as I mentioned, I'm a fan of the lasso tool. Some people can use that magnetic lasso tool. It never works for me. I've been trying it for years. This is my tool of choice. Some people use the pen tool. I think it takes too long, and it's not any more accurate than this. Every tool in here, it just takes a little practice. All right, so now That is selected, and delete. And deselect, Command D. So that's starting to separate that from the background. Z is zoom. Just press the Z key, and now look at all these bits that were actually deleted when I was selecting by color. So if you're going to use select by color, I strongly suggest that the color in the background and the foreground be very distinctly different from each other, or you're going to get issues like this, which might not be pretty in the long run. But that is essentially how to select and deselect. Now, when I am satisfied with this and I want to put this into another document from Photoshop, what I will need to do to maintain the transparent edge, or transparent background rather, is I'm going to have to save it with what is known as a clipping path on it. A clipping path is a vector object that Photoshop saves, well, that you save in Photoshop, so that when you drop this artwork into another program, it maintains the transparency. And I'm not going to go through this and make it absolutely perfect. In fact, I think it might be more interesting for you to see what happens with these kind of stray, anomalous elements throughout. And I'll delete that. Okay, so I'm going to call that good enough. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a menu called Paths. And let's see if we can actually open up the Paths menu. Let's try that again. Window, Paths should be open somewhere. All right, I'm going to reset my view here. Workspace and Essentials and Window, Workspace, Reset Essentials. Yeah, well, because I'm projecting, it's not showing me the whole interface here. So there is the Paths panel right back there. And this Paths panel has a tool on it, kind of a strange tool here, that will turn a selection into a path. And again, a path is a vector, a line, similar to what you would see in Illustrator. So to generate the vector path for the clipping mask, I'm going to choose from the select menu, load selection, and layer 0 is the name of this layer, transparency. And so I now have marching ants around all of the actual pixels in the image. If you look down here on this Paths menu, this button I'm hovering over says Make Work Path from Selection. When I click it, it has now made a work path from the selection. All those extra points are all the debris that is in the background that I have not erased or cleaned up. I'm just going to leave it like this for your education here. It'll let you see what happens if it's not really clean. And then you need to actually rename this. If you leave it named work path and you make another path, this path will just disappear. So you do have to name this, and I'll just call this objects. Nothing fancy. The next step is, with this selected, you go to the flyout menu and you choose clipping mask or clipping path. And I just usually leave this at the default setting, which is leaving the flatness field blank. And now all of a sudden the word objects becomes very bold. It just changed from a normal font to a bold font. And I'm going to save this as if I was going to place this into InDesign. So I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to save it as the TIFF file format. TIFF file format is a compressed file format. It stands for Tagged Image File Format, and it's a smaller format than EPS, much more portable, smaller, easier to work with, and it will save layers. I don't really need it to save layers. It will save this as a copy. It doesn't really need to save it as a copy, but I don't really need to turn off layers. But just so you know, if I include layers, it'll make it a larger file size. There is no file called objects TIFF, so I don't know why it has to save it as a copy. And it's okay to embed this color profile because this is the preferred print color profile. We talked about that another evening, didn't we not? Yeah. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is saved, in fact, to the desktop. And now it's going to tell me here what my options are. I could save the transparency as well, and sometimes this is just as good or better than the clipping path. So many programs do not support transparency in a TIFF, but InDesign does. So I'll click yes. And other than that, everything's ready to go, and it is now saved to my desktop. Now I'm going to toggle over to InDesign here. It might be helpful if I open InDesign, so I'll do that. Yes. I'll do it in both. It's already 8 o'clock. All right, in InDesign, I'm just going to start a new file. Not a book, flailing there. A new document. And click OK. And here's my page. And on my page, I'm going to create a text box. And I'm going to tell this text box to use 14-point type and not minion. I would prefer something else, a little bit more stylish, and I think I will go with Myriad. I'm a fan of Myriad, and then I'll go to type and I'll choose fill with placeholder text. Okay, now I'm going to insert my object into place and show you how the clipping mask works. Okay, so I'm going to choose File, Place, and here's my object's TIFF. You can see here it looks like it's on a gray background with a bunch of blue stuff around it. When I click, there's the object. Okay, it's really large, and I'm going to resize the box that it's in first, and then I'm going to choose Object, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. Object, Fitting, Fit Content Proportionally. Great. Following this, you can see that there's the transparency. It appears to have a white background. Finally, if I go to Window and choose Text Wrap, with this object selected, I'm going to choose the middle choice, which is Wraparound Object Shape. The key and the other pieces, here's owl, pendant, now have the type wrapped around it. And if I increase the boundary around the text, now you start seeing all those weird little anomalies out here that are messing us up. So that's why it's really important to do a clean job and not leave those in there. But it is kind of interesting nevertheless, and it is working as a wrap. One could essentially use the direct selection tool here and delete those, but that's just really painful and time consuming. I would rather just go back to the Illustrator file and the Photoshop file and do it correctly. You know, much more slowly. So when this is selected and you look here at what it's using, contour options, same as clipping, that's using the clipping path. Here I could use alpha channel. That would be using the transparency of the image, which is almost the same thing, but not quite. Looks a little bit better with just transparency on the setting. Make sense? Okay, and so now I'll just do it in Illustrator, and then we'll call this tutorial done. So I'll make a new file. And in this case, we'll just say that we have assorted circles of various shades. Okay, and I'll just change the colors on these rapidly. And then File, Place. Here's the art. And I'm going to click and drag a box so it'll fill just the box. And that's it. Not bad. Tuck this in the corner here. These strings can look like they're going. Come back. Huh? 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 Nope. That's better. Let's just do this. Select all, move it over. And there you have it. Okay.
You saved it as a TIFF, right?
I did save it as a TIFF.